On the evening of September 30th, 2024, a familiar presence from millions of living rooms slipped away quietly, far from the barns, back roads, and dusty treasure hunts that once defined him. Frank Fritz was gone at 60, and the shock did not come from spectacle. It came from the cruel simplicity of it, a life that had always seemed in motion, suddenly ending in stillness. For years, Frank's face meant comfort to viewers who loved the idea that history could be rescued with nothing but patience, instinct, and a good eye. He was the guy who could turn a beat-up sign or a forgotten kid into a story worth telling. The guy whose dry humor cut through the noise and made everything feel real. When American Pickers premiered on January 18, 2010, it did not just sell the thrill of the hunt. It sold the chemistry of two longtime friends on the road, and Frank's grounded presence was a pillar of that appeal. But the heartbreak in Frank Fritz's story is not only that he died. It is that, in many ways, people watched him disappear in stages without fully understanding what was happening. The public saw the laughter, the oddball negotiations, the quick one-liners. What most did not see was the slow tightening of limits around his life, the kind that does not arrive with a single headline, but with years of strain. After his death, reporting around the cause cut through rumor with a bleak clarity. Frank's death certificate listed late sequela of cerebral infarction, meaning long-term effects from a stroke. In other words, the decisive blow was not a sudden mystery. It was the lingering aftermath of a catastrophic event his body never truly escaped. That detail reorients everything. It reframes the last chapter as something less like a twist and more like a prolonged battle that ended the way so many battles do, not with drama, but with exhaustion. Frank suffered a severe stroke in July 2022 and was found in his home in Davenport, Iowa, before being rushed to medical care and later placed into rehabilitation. A judge subsequently appointed a longtime friend as a temporary guardian to help manage personal affairs, while a local bank was put in charge of finances, an arrangement that quietly signals just how serious the impairment had become. To fans, the most haunting part is how this medical reality ran parallel to the emotional storyline they sensed but could not confirm. Frank had been absent from American Pickers for years before his death, and the distance between him and the show became a wound the audience kept touching, hoping it would heal. When Wolfe announced Frank's passing, the tone carried the weight of decades. It was not just a statement about a former co-star. It read like a man mourning a shared lifetime, a friendship that had survived long roads and long silences, even if it could not outrun time. And then there is the human part that makes this tragedy feel personal, even to strangers. A stroke is not simply a medical event. It is a theft. It can take speech, movement, independence, identity. The person you were yesterday becomes a version you have to relearn, and sometimes the body refuses to return what was taken. When the official cause of death points back to stroke complications, it hints at months and years where Frank's world likely narrowed, where routines became medical schedules, where a man once known for roaming America's backroads had to live inside a far smaller perimeter. That is why the story lands so heavily. Frank's public image was built on motion, curiosity, the joy of uncovering what others overlooked. The end of his life, as reported, was defined by the opposite: immobility, diminished capacity, and a long tail of consequences. It is the kind of contrast that feels unfair on a primal level, like watching a musician lose hearing or a runner lose legs. In the hours after the news spread, fans returned to old clips and familiar scenes, not because they wanted nostalgia, but because nostalgia is sometimes the only way to fight grief. They wanted to see Frank as he was, sharp-witted, stubborn, alive with that unmistakable spark. They wanted to hold on to the version of him that time could not finish rewriting. And yet, the hardest question remains the one no obituary can answer. When you strip away the cameras and the brand of a hit TV show, what did Frank Fritz carry in the quiet moments, especially after everything changed? What did he miss most? The road, the hunt, the friendship, or simply the freedom of being himself without effort? To the audience, Frank Fritz's life looked like a dream built out of back roads and barn doors. Week after week, he and Mike Wolfe rolled into small towns, knocked on doors, and coaxed forgotten Americana back into daylight. It felt spontaneous, almost effortless, two friends chasing the next story. But the truth about success, especially televised success, is that it does not simply elevate you. It compresses you. It turns your passions into schedules, your friendships into brands, and your body into a machine that is expected to perform on demand. When American Pickers premiered on January 18th, 2010, it immediately proved there was a massive audience for the hunt itself. The negotiation, the personalities, the strange and beautiful objects hiding in plain sight. The show's format was built on authenticity, and Frank embodied that authenticity in a way reality TV rarely manages. He was not polished. He did not host. He reacted. He joked. He pushed back. He lit up when he found something small and weird that meant nothing to most people, but everything to him. That is why his absence later felt so jarring. Fans did not simply miss a cast member. They missed a specific kind of presence, someone who made the show feel grounded, as if you were riding along with a real person rather than watching a constructed character. But the same things that made Frank compelling also made him vulnerable. The show required relentless travel and long stretches away from home. A reality series is not a single performance. It is a lifestyle. It runs on early mornings, late nights, constant movement, and physical work, climbing into packed barns, lifting heavy items, standing for hours, repeating the same social rhythm again and again. Meet strangers, earn trust quickly, negotiate firmly, smile for the camera, then drive on. Over time, that grind can erode even healthy people. For someone recovering from health complications, it can become unforgiving. And while fans do not need every private detail to respect a person's boundaries, the broader arc becomes unavoidable. Frank's life was not only the joy of picking, it was the weight of sustaining a public identity while his private world became harder to manage. By the early 2020s, reports and profiles looking back on his career describe how the partnership and the show went through strain, and that Frank's run on the series effectively ended around 2020, with public confirmation later that he would not be returning. The timeline matters because it explains why his story took on such a painful tone. His relationship with the show that made him famous did not conclude with a celebratory farewell, but with distance, first gradual, then final. For the audience, the distance raised uncomfortable questions. Was Frank pushed out? Did he step away? Were there disagreements behind the scenes? The absence of a clean narrative created a vacuum, and vacuums fill with speculation. Some viewers interpreted the shift as a simple casting change. Others took it personally, as if a friend had vanished mid-conversation. What makes this kind of story uniquely heartbreaking is that the public's longing for closure often collides with realities that do not offer closure. Friendship is rarely a straight line. Long-time bonds can fracture under pressure, misunderstandings, pride, and exhaustion. And television adds a new layer of distortion. The world watches your relationship as entertainment, while you're still living it as a human being. After Frank's death, people's reporting on the decades-long relationship between Wolfe and Fritz emphasized that their friendship had highs and lows, and that at one point they had not spoken for an extended period. It is the kind of detail that lands heavily because it reframes the show's on-screen chemistry as something both genuine and fragile, real enough to crack. Then came July 2022, the medical turning point that casts a long shadow over everything that followed. According to Radio Iowa, Frank was found in his Davenport home and rushed to a hospital after suffering a stroke, later receiving care in a rehabilitation facility. The same report notes that a judge appointed a longtime friend as temporary guardian for personal decisions and placed a bank in charge of his finances. Those are not routine administrative steps. They are signals that the consequences were serious enough that Frank's independence and capacity, at least temporarily, could not be assumed. When you read that, the story shifts again. Frank did not simply step away from television life. His life itself had changed shape. and it makes the later cause of death reporting feel less like an isolated fact and more like the final line of a longer sentence. Multiple outlets, citing the death certificate, reported that Frank died due to late sequela of cerebral infarction, meaning long-term effects of a stroke. The tragedy is built into the phrasing, not a stroke, but long-term effects. Not a single moment, but an aftermath that kept unfolding. In the wake of his passing, Mike Wolfe's public words also took on deeper meaning. People reported that Wolfe shared the news of Frank's death on Instagram and reflected on him as someone sensitive as well as funny, describing how much Frank meant to him. Even without parsing every sentence, the emotional logic is clear. When someone dies after years of complications and distance, grief is rarely clean. It is mixed with regret, memory, and the painful awareness that time does not negotiate. That is the cruel irony of Frank Fritz's story. He became famous for negotiating, finding a way to reach agreement, to pull value from what looked broken, to rescue something before it disappeared. But in his own life, there were forces that could not be bargained with: illness, decline, and the narrowing of options after a catastrophic stroke. For fans, the heartbreak is not only that he is gone. It is that for a long stretch, he was gone from the version of life they shared with him, gone from the road, gone from the show, gone from the easy banter that made history feel fun. And then he was gone completely. Because whatever tensions existed, whatever private battles were unfolding, July 14th, 2022 was the day his life took a turn so severe that the future he imagined, quietly rebuilding, maybe returning, maybe reconciling, became a question mark overnight. It happened in the most ordinary setting possible, his own home in Davenport, Iowa. There was no camera crew, no banter, no barn doors swinging open to reveal a hidden treasure, just silence. And then, according to what those close to him later described, a friend found Frank unconscious and called for emergency help. That detail alone carries a chilling weight, because it implies what might have happened if help had arrived even a little later. A stroke does not negotiate. It does not give second chances because you were a beloved TV personality. It simply takes what it takes. When a stroke hit, it didn't just knock Frank down, it changed the terms of his entire existence. People often talk about stroke recovery as a straight line: hospital, rehab, improvement. The reality is closer to a jagged staircase in the dark. Some days you climb, some days you slide. And the losses are not always dramatic. They can be humiliatingly small. The word you can't find, the step you can't trust, the hand that won't do what you tell it to do. In Frank's case, the transcript you provided makes it clear that the damage was significant enough to affect speech, mobility, and cognitive function. And when all three of those are impacted, life becomes less about getting back to normal and more about learning a new normal you never asked for. After the initial hospitalization, Frank was moved to a rehabilitation center, and the work began. Not the work he loved: searching, bargaining, restoring. The work that is pure survival, repeating basic movements until the brain remaps a pathway, repeating phrases until the tongue cooperates, repeating daily tasks until they stop feeling impossible. Rehab is physically exhausting, but it's also emotionally brutal because progress is slow and the mirror is honest. You remember who you were. You can see who you are now, and you're forced to live in the gap between those two versions of yourself. For someone like Frank, that gap had to be agonizing. He built his public identity on being capable. He was the guy who crawled into cluttered spaces and came out holding value. He was the guy who could spot what other people missed. He was the guy who could talk fast when the negotiation got tense and crack a dry joke when things got awkward. After the stroke, the transcript suggests that even engaging with the world became difficult. The man who made history feel alive was now fighting just to hold on to the basic tools that let him participate in life. This is also where the story takes on an additional layer that most fans never think about until it happens to someone they love: the legal and logistical reality of long-term impairment. In Frank's case, a court-appointed guardian was assigned to oversee finances and medical care. On paper, that sounds procedural. In real life, it's heartbreaking. It signals that the situation had moved beyond he's recovering into he needs protection, structure, and constant support. It is a quiet acknowledgement that independence, one of the most invisible privileges, had become fragile. Friends who visited him during this period reportedly described him as a shadow of his former self. That phrase gets used often, but here it lands differently because so much of Frank's public charm depended on his energy. Not a manufactured TV energy, but the genuine spark of someone who loved the hunt. Imagine being that person, and then waking up in a body that won't move like it used to, in a mind that tires faster than it used to, in a world that suddenly feels too fast, too loud, too complicated. The grief isn't only in the people around you. It's inside you, too, because you are forced to mourn yourself while you're still here. And yet, even in that diminished state, the transcript indicates something quietly beautiful. Frank still talked about what mattered to him. Antiques, the show, the friendships, the road. That detail is crucial because it suggests that underneath the damage and the limitations, the core of him remained. He was still Frank, the collector, the storyteller, the man who believed objects could carry memories. Even when his body failed him, his heart kept returning to the same places: the barns, the signs, the old cans, the thrill of uncovering a piece of the past. Meanwhile, outside the rehab walls, the world kept spinning. Fans kept hoping for a reunion with Mike Wolfe. People wanted that moment because it would make the pain feel organized, friendship strained, then healed, absence explained, then corrected. But life does not always provide the narrative we crave. According to the transcript, Mike did express concern publicly after the stroke, asking for prayers. That matters because it shows something important. Even with distance, even with a strained relationship, the bond was not erased. Sometimes people don't know how to fix what broke between them, but they still care when the other person is hurting. Sometimes love survives without being able to speak fluently. The hardest part is that stroke recovery can be a long, uncertain tunnel. The transcript describes the next 2 years as largely out of the public eye, with progress slow and Frank requiring around-the-clock care. That kind of life is not dramatic in the way television is dramatic. It is repetitive. It is medical appointments, therapy sessions, careful monitoring, small wins, setbacks, and the constant effort of the people around him to keep him safe. It is also loneliness, because even when you're surrounded by caregivers, you can still feel isolated from the life you used to have. Then came the final chapter, September 30th, 2024. The transcript says Frank passed away due to the long-term effects of a cerebral infarction, damage caused when blood flow to the brain is interrupted. The phrasing is haunting because it makes the timeline clear. This wasn't simply an event that happened back then. It was a continuing consequence that followed him, reshaping everything until it ended him. In the weeks leading up to his death, the transcript describes him as fragile, movements limited, speech impaired, his engagement with the world greatly diminished. And yet, it also suggests that he had, in some way, come to terms with what was happening. That does not mean he wasn't afraid. It means he may have reached that quiet place some people reach near the end, where fighting turns into reflecting, where the mind stops chasing what if and starts holding on to what was. If Frank's last conversations really did circle back to antiques, to American pickers, to the friendships he built, then the story becomes even more devastating, because it means his final emotional anchors were the very things that once made him feel most alive. The objects, the road, the shared laughter, the sense of purpose that came from preserving history one find at a time. And that is why this tragedy is so utterly heartbreaking. It wasn't just the loss of celebrity. It was the slow closing of a world that Frank built with his own hands and his own passion. A man who rescued forgotten treasures ended up becoming, in a cruel twist, someone the world could only remember through reruns and memories, because the final years took him away from the life he loved long before they took him away entirely. When Fritz died on September 30th, 2024, the grief spread in a way that felt oddly intimate. Not because the public truly knew him, but because American pickers had spent years convincing people they did. Frank wasn't presented as an untouchable celebrity. He was presented as the guy you rode with, someone stubborn, funny, occasionally prickly, but always honest. So when the news landed, it didn't feel like losing a TV figure. It felt like losing a presence. Mike Wolfe's message made that feeling unavoidable. In his Instagram post announcing Frank's passing, Mike didn't write like a network spokesperson. He wrote like someone who had just been gutted, someone trying to explain a loss that was too large for the platform it was posted on. He referenced knowing Frank for more than half his life, and the tone carried the weight of decades, not seasons. That post became a kind of emotional anchor for fans because it confirmed something viewers needed to believe, that whatever happened between them, the bond wasn't erased. People who had spent years watching their chemistry on screen had also spent years wondering about the distance off screen. There's a specific kind of pain in witnessing a friendship that once seemed unbreakable become strained, then realizing the clock ran out before anyone could see a clean resolution. In the days that followed, the tributes poured in from viewers, collectors, and the broader reality TV world. Messages that were less about stardom and more about what Frank represented: curiosity, authenticity, and the idea that history lives in the overlooked. Many fans returned to the same clips: Frank grinning over a small, useless collectible, or cracking a dry one-liner that made the moment feel unscripted. They were trying to preserve him the way he preserved objects, by pulling the best parts into the present and refusing to let them disappear. Then the cause of death reporting arrived, and the story became even heavier. Multiple outlets reported that Frank's death certificate listed late sequela of cerebral infarction, meaning long-term effects of a stroke, with additional context that the stroke was tied to underlying cerebrovascular disease. The phrase itself is haunting. It doesn't suggest a single sudden event so much as a long aftermath that never truly ended. It implies years of consequences, limitations, vulnerability, and a body living under the shadow of a devastating injury. That detail also connects the public's final memories to a timeline many had only vaguely understood. Frank suffered a serious stroke in July 2022 and was found in his Davenport home before being rushed to the hospital. Later that year, a judge appointed a longtime friend as temporary guardian and placed a local bank in charge of his finances. Facts that quietly communicate how severe the situation had become. Those aren't steps taken when everything is fine. Those are steps taken when independence becomes uncertain. So when fans asked in late 2024 what really happened to Frank, the answer was not a tidy scandal or a dramatic twist. It was a grim, familiar reality. A major stroke, followed by a long period of impairment, followed by the long-term medical consequences that ultimately took him. And that is where the heartbreak deepens, because it reframes his absence from the spotlight. Frank didn't simply vanish from television life. He was pulled away from it by forces that do not care whether a person is beloved. Stroke recovery is often brutal, slow, and unpredictable. The public rarely sees that part because it doesn't fit the rhythm of entertainment. But it is real life in its most unforgiving form. In the wake of the death certificate details, Mike's grief took on additional meaning. Because now viewers could connect the emotional dots. The announcement, the tributes, the recognition that Frank's final years were likely defined not by adventures and laughter, but by medical dependence and narrowing horizons. Even without knowing every private moment, the arc becomes clear. What makes the aftermath feel especially unresolved is that the audience still carries a lingering what if. What if Frank had returned, even briefly? What if they had shared one last on-camera moment? Nothing staged, just two old friends acknowledging the road they traveled. What if the friendship had been repaired earlier? Those questions persist because people want a narrative that teaches something simple. That mistakes can be corrected, that distance can be closed, that time can be bargained with. But real life, like Frank's death certificate language, is not negotiable. Months later, Mike Wolfe continued to speak in ways that suggested the loss wasn't fading. It was settling into everything. In a later interview with People, he described still checking in with Frank's loved ones, reflecting on their long friendship. and keeping the connection alive through the people Frank left behind. That kind of detail matters because it shifts grief from a public statement into a long-term practice. It implies that Frank is not being remembered only as a former co-host, but as someone whose life is still woven into the daily reality of those who knew him best. And then there's the legacy Frank leaves to the audience, quiet but powerful. Frank made old stuff feel meaningful. He taught viewers that the value of an object isn't only in its price tag. It's in its story, its craftsmanship, its connection to a time and a life that would otherwise be forgotten. For many fans, that lesson outlasts the show itself. It shows up in how people browse flea markets, how they talk to older relatives about what they kept and why, how they look at something worn and think, someone loved this once. Frank Fritz spent his life rescuing pieces of the past. In the end, the world tried to rescue him the only way it could, through memories, reruns, and the collective refusal to let his story be reduced to a headline. And maybe that is the final tragedy. Frank understood better than anyone that time is ruthless and that what disappears doesn't always come back. But he also believed that what matters can be preserved if someone cares enough to look closely. When someone like Frank Fritz dies, the grief isn't only about the person. It's about what they represented. For millions of viewers, Frank was never just a reality TV star. He was proof of something quieter and rarer, that you could live a life built around curiosity, craftsmanship, and respect for the past, without pretending to be anyone else. That is why the loss still lingers. Because Frank's appeal wasn't manufactured. It was personal. Frank didn't feel like a celebrity because he never behaved like one. He looked like someone you'd see at a flea market on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, scanning tables with a patient, almost stubborn focus. On screen, he didn't perform excitement the way reality television often demands. His enthusiasm was selective, and that made it believable. When Frank lit up, you knew it wasn't for the camera. It was because something in front of him genuinely mattered. And what mattered to him was rarely what mattered to everyone else. Wolfe often chased the big items, large signs, rare machines, centerpieces that could anchor a shop display. Frank, on the other hand, had a soft spot for the overlooked. Old cans, small advertising pieces, trinkets most people would call junk. That wasn't a quirk. It was a worldview. Frank's taste suggested something deeper, that history isn't only housed in museums or wrapped in velvet ropes. Sometimes it's sitting on a dusty shelf, waiting for someone with the right eyes to recognize it. That is a powerful thing to teach people, especially in a culture obsessed with the new. Because American Pickers, at its best, was never really about objects. It was about memory, about human lives embedded in metal, glass, paper, and paint. The show made people listen to strangers talk about their father's garages, their grandmother's kitchens, their childhood toys. It made people ask why they kept what they kept. Frank was the emotional bridge in those conversations. He didn't just buy, he validated. He made collectors feel seen, even when their collections were odd, messy, or misunderstood. That's why so many fans describe him like a friend or even family. It wasn't parasocial in the shallow sense. It was familiarity earned through repetition and sincerity. If you watched the show for years, Frank became part of your routine. He was there on weeknights, on weekends, in the background while dinner was cooking, while kids were doing homework, while someone was folding laundry. People didn't schedule their lives around Frank, but he was present in them. And presence, over time, becomes attachment. That attachment turned into something heavier when Frank disappeared from the series. Because absence in television is different from absence in real life. In real life, you can call someone. You can visit. You can ask what's wrong. As a viewer, you can't. You can only notice the gap and try to make sense of it from a distance. That helplessness is part of what makes this story so haunting. Fans saw the signs, less screen time, fewer updates, the sense that something had shifted. They felt the tension even when they didn't understand the details. And then, years later, they were asked to accept that the ending had already been written while they were still hoping for a reunion episode that would never come. There's also something uniquely heartbreaking about the nature of Frank's brand. if you can call it that. Frank built his identity on restoration, on taking something broken, forgotten, rusted, and giving it a second life. Viewers wanted that same arc for him. They wanted Frank to get another chance the way the objects did. They wanted his story to follow the logic he lived by, that nothing is too far gone if you care enough to work on it. But human bodies aren't like old signs. You can't sand down neurological damage and repaint the edges. You can't replace a part and expect the whole machine to run again. Some injuries don't restore. They only change. And that harsh truth sits at the center of why people can't shake this story. Frank's philosophy was hope, but his ending was limitation. Even the unresolved nature of his relationship with Mike feeds that ache. Not because audiences demand private closure, but because the show framed them as partners, as brothers in arms on the road. People are wired to want reconciliation. One last handshake, one last laugh, one last shared moment that says we're okay. When death arrives before that moment, it feels like a door slammed in the middle of a sentence. And yet, there's a version of closure that doesn't require a scripted reunion. Frank's legacy lives in what he changed in people. He made viewers care about craftsmanship in an age that throws things away. He made people slow down and look closer. He made old feel valuable rather than embarrassing. He encouraged everyday curiosity about tools, about brands, about the lives behind objects. If you've ever walked through an antique store and found yourself imagining who used an item, where it traveled, what it meant, Frank's influence is in that instinct. He also modeled something subtle but important, a kind of masculinity that wasn't performative. He wasn't selling toughness. He wasn't playing hero. He was simply himself, sometimes blunt, sometimes tender, sometimes stubborn, often funny. In a genre that can drift into caricature, Frank stayed human. That humanity is what makes the story painful, but it's also what makes it lasting. Because in the end, Frank Fritz wasn't remembered for being perfect. He was remembered for being real and for making the past feel worth saving. And that leaves one question, the kind that stays in the mind long after a video ends. If Frank's life taught us to rescue what time tries to bury, what do we do with the parts of a person's story that time buried before we were ready to say goodbye? There's a particular cruelty in the way the public consumes someone's life in episodes. You see the highlights, the jokes, the wins, the banter on the road, and your mind fills in the rest with a comforting assumption. If they can smile on camera, they must be okay off camera. Frank Fritz's story challenges that assumption in the most painful way possible. Because if you strip away the fame, what remains is a reality that many families know too well. Chronic illness, unpredictable decline, and the way a single medical event can redraw a person's future in permanent ink. Frank lived for years with health issues that didn't fit neatly into the adventure narrative of American pickers. Viewers might have noticed weight changes, fatigue, moments where he seemed quieter. But television isn't designed to linger on the invisible. It moves on. It cuts to the next location, the next barn, the next find. And in doing so, it sometimes trains the audience to treat the person as durable, someone who will always show up. That's why his later years feel so unsettling. The show continued, life continued, and yet Frank's world was narrowing. When his stroke happened in 2022, the shift wasn't only physical, it was existential. A stroke doesn't just take function. It can take identity. It can take the ability to do the thing you built your life around, and it can do it overnight. In this case, the hardest detail is also the simplest. The reported cause of death points back to long-term effects of that stroke. That means the final chapter wasn't a sudden cliff edge. It was a slope, slow, exhausting, and often hidden from public view. It suggests a long period where Frank's daily reality may have been measured in therapy sessions, medication schedules, and incremental progress that the outside world never applauded. That contrast between the Frank we watched and the Frank who endured creates a kind of grief that isn't just sadness, but guilt. Fans replay old episodes and realize they were cheering while he was quietly paying a price. And the truth is, that guilt is understandable, but it's also misplaced. No viewer caused his decline. The real issue is how easily entertainment encourages us to forget that the people on screen are still mortal, still vulnerable, still one injury away from a life they didn't plan. There's also a broader lesson here about friendship under pressure. The public has a habit of turning relationships into sides. Team Mike, Team Frank, who betrayed who was right, who was wrong. But real friendships don't behave like fan debates. They behave like living things, shaped by time, stress, misunderstanding, ego, exhaustion, and the weight of shared history. If Frank and Mike did drift apart, the tragedy isn't simply that they drifted. It's that life did what it often does. It made reconciliation harder, then it made it impossible. And that should unsettle anyone who has a strained relationship they keep putting off. Not because every friendship must be repaired, but because time rarely announces when it's about to run out. Another uncomfortable truth sits beneath all of this. Fame can be isolating, especially when it fades. When you're on a hit show, the world is loud around you. People call. Opportunities appear. Your presence matters in a measurable way. When you step away, whether by choice, by conflict, or by health, silence rushes in. The phone rings less. Your daily rhythm changes. You realize how many connections were built on proximity and momentum rather than deep roots. If Frank's final years were spent largely out of the public eye, that silence may have been part of the burden. Even with caregivers and friends, living with serious impairment can be intensely lonely. You could be surrounded and still feel left behind by your own body, by your old life, by the world that once expected you to be Frank the Picker every time you showed up. And yet, there's something strangely fitting, almost poetic, in the way Frank is remembered. He built his career around honoring what time tries to erase. He treated old objects with respect because he believed they mattered beyond their surface value. In the aftermath of his death, fans did the same for him. They treated his life as something worth preserving, worth revisiting, worth speaking about with care rather than consumption. That is the best kind of legacy, when people don't only miss you, but they see the world differently because you existed in it. So what do we do with Frank Fritz's story now? We can let it be a piece of gossip, a sad ending, a dramatic headline, a comment section argument. Or we can let it be what Frank would have wanted any forgotten object to be, a reminder. A reminder that what looks strong may be struggling. That distance can harden into permanence. That later is not guaranteed. And that the things we dismiss, whether an old tool or an old friendship, can carry more meaning than we realize. In the end, perhaps the most heartbreaking part is also the most human. Frank spent a lifetime rescuing what others overlooked, yet his own suffering unfolded partly in the shadows, where the world attention rarely lingers. And that leaves us with a question that isn't about television at all. If someone in your life was quietly fading by illness, by stress, by isolation, would you recognize it in time to reach them? There are endings that feel like a shock, and endings that feel like a slow closing of a door you've been watching for years. Frank Fritz's death is painful because, in a way, it was both. The headline hit fast. September 30th, 2024, Frank gone at 60, but the tragedy behind it had been building for a long time, quietly, in the spaces the cameras never captured. For many fans, the first instinct was disbelief. Frank was supposed to be the guy still out there somewhere, still digging through barns, still laughing at the absurd things people kept in their sheds, still chasing the next forgotten piece of America. Even after he left American Pickers, people held onto a simple hope that one day he'd return, even briefly, and everything would feel right again. Not perfect, just right. One more ride, one more pick, one more moment that proved the story didn't end in silence. But life rarely gives closure in the shape we want. The details that emerged after his passing made that truth even harder to swallow. Reporting on Frank's death certificate described the cause as late sequela of cerebral infarction, meaning long-term effects of stroke-related brain injury. That phrase matters because it tells you this wasn't a random lightning strike in 2024. It was the long shadow of what happened in 2022, years of fragility, recovery attempts, limitations, and a body that never fully returned to the life Frank once lived. And it's in that long shadow where the emotional weight truly sits. Because the Frank people remember is the Frank of motion, leaning into a dusty barn, pulling out a rusted sign, grinning like a kid who just found a secret. He was built for the road, built for the hunt, built for the simple satisfaction of rescuing something old and giving it a second chance. The idea that he spent his final years far from that world, largely out of the public eye, recovering, impaired, dependent, creates a kind of grief that doesn't resolve. It only deepens. In the days after his death, Mike Wolfe's words cut through speculation and reminded everyone of what this story was always really about: a long friendship. Mike announced Frank's passing publicly and spoke of knowing him for decades, of sharing a life on the road, and a bond that went back far beyond television. And for fans, that message landed like both comfort and heartbreak. Comfort because it confirmed Frank was still cared for. Heartbreak because it also highlighted what people had feared. Time ran out before the friendship could be publicly fixed in the way audiences had hoped. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Reconciliation isn't always a dramatic moment. Sometimes it's simply the fact that someone still mourns you. Sometimes it's the fact that, despite distance and disagreements, they still carry you in their life. Mike's grief didn't erase the years that were complicated, but it did prove something important: that the story between them was never reduced to a fight or a rumor. It was bigger than that. It was human. And Frank's legacy is bigger than the circumstances of his exit. Yes, people will debate the later seasons. They'll argue about who did what, who said what, who should have reached out sooner. But the truth is, Fritz changed something in the culture around him. He made millions of people care about objects they would have otherwise ignored. He made history feel touchable. He gave dignity to the overlooked. He made the past feel like something worth saving, not because it was expensive, but because it was real. That's why so many fans feel like they lost more than a TV personality. They lost a certain kind of comfort, the idea that you can live an ordinary life with an extraordinary passion, and that passion can carry you through. Frank represented a world where curiosity was enough, where knowledge mattered, where craftsmanship wasn't outdated, and where the thrill of discovery didn't require wealth or status, just the willingness to look closely. But his story also leaves a sharper lesson, one that's harder to sit with. Passion doesn't make you invincible. Humor doesn't protect you from decline. Fame doesn't stop illness from taking what it wants. And friendship, no matter how deep, can still be strained by time, stress, and silence. In the end, Frank's life feels like one of the very stories he loved to uncover. A man with a gift for finding value where others saw none. A man who preserved pieces of America's forgotten past. A man whose own final chapter became, tragically, something many people didn't fully see until it was over. And maybe that's the final irony. Frank spent his career proving that what is left behind still matters. After his death, he became proof of that philosophy. Because what he left behind isn't just footage and quotes. It's a way of looking at the world, slower, more attentive, more respectful of the stories hidden in plain sight. So how should Fritz be remembered? As the bearded, sharp-witted picker who made history fun? As the friend who helped build a cultural phenomenon? As the man who fought long battles off camera that many never understood? Or as something even simpler, and perhaps more powerful, a reminder that what we love can define us, but it can't save us from time. And that leaves one final question, the kind that lingers long after the screen goes dark. If someone you cared about was quietly slipping away through illness, isolation, or the weight of life, would you recognize it soon enough to reach them before the last goodbye becomes permanent?